Welcome to Horror Camp. I know these videos are meant to help you drift off to sleep, but before you do, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another chilling tale. The bus rumbled to a stop at the edge of the forest, the gravel crunching under its wheels as it settled into place. We clambered out, backpacks slung over our shoulders, and took our first real look at the woods. The trees stood tall and imposing, their branches twisting together like skeletal hands, blocking most of the sunlight from reaching the ground. The air smelled of pine, damp earth, and something faintly metallic that I couldn't quite place. Mr. Henderson, our teacher, stepped out behind us, clipboard in hand. His usual cheerful demeanor was subdued, and his voice carried a tone of forced authority as he addressed us. "All right, everyone, listen up. I need you to stay together, follow the marked trails, and for the love of everything good, don't wander off. This forest isn't as tame as it looks." We all exchanged skeptical looks. "Tame as it looks," Jason muttered under his breath, smirking. "What's so scary about some trees and squirrels?" Mr. Henderson handed Sarah a map and tapped it with his pen. "Here's the layout. Stick to the clearing I marked and don't go beyond it. I'll check in on you tomorrow morning." We nodded, barely paying attention, too eager to get started. After all, this was our chance to be free, to be out from under the watchful eyes of adults for a few days. We laughed and joked as we shouldered our gear, following the narrow dirt path that would take us to our campsite. The forest seemed endless, the trees towering over us like silent sentinels, but we didn't care. The clearing was exactly as described, a small patch of flat ground surrounded by dense trees, with just enough space to pitch our tents and set up a campfire. It wasn't much, but it felt like ours. We wasted no time getting to work. Jason and Mike struggled with their tent, arguing over which pole went where, while Sarah rolled her eyes and had hers up in minutes. Rachel and Emily were off gathering firewood, their laughter echoing through the trees as they stumbled over roots and twigs. And me? I just soaked it all in, the cool breeze on my face and the faint hum of life in the woods. By the time the sun hung low in the sky, the camp was fully set up. 3 tents formed a rough semicircle around the fire pit, where we'd already started cooking hot dogs on skewers. The air was filled with the smell of charred meat and smoke, and for the first time in what felt like forever, we were all just happy. The first ghost story of the night came from Jason, of course. He had a flair for the dramatic, leaning in close to the fire so the light cast sharp shadows across his face. And when the couple finally unlocked the door, he said, pausing for effect, they found the hook still hanging from the car door handle. Sarah groaned, tossing a marshmallow at him. "Jason, that's ancient. My grandma knows that one." "Oh, I'm sorry. Did I interrupt your riveting tales of knitting and bingo?" He shot back, grinning. Laughter rippled through the group as Emily started on her story, this one about a haunted doll that moved when no one was looking. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the cool night air, and for a while, it felt like nothing could go wrong. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and purple, the atmosphere began to change. At first it was subtle. The birdsong, which had been a constant background melody throughout the day, faded away. The rustling of leaves in the wind grew quieter, until the only sounds were our voices and the occasional crackle of the fire. "Is it just me, or is it really quiet all of a sudden?" Rachel asked, glancing around. "Yeah, so," Mike replied, poking at the fire with a stick. "It's night. Animals go to sleep." "Duh." but Rachel wasn't convinced. No, it's more than that. It's like too quiet. I felt it too. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive. Heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Jason, ever the Joker, took the opportunity to stand up and make a show of peering into the darkness. "Maybe it's Bigfoot," he said, cupping his hands around his mouth. "Hey, buddy, you out there?" "Jason, knock it off," Sarah snapped, her voice sharper than usual. But Jason didn't stop. He picked up a flashlight and shone it into the trees, waving it back and forth. "Relax, Sarah. It's just..." He stopped mid-sentence, his flashlight fixed on something in the distance. "What is it?" I asked, standing up. For a moment, Jason didn't respond. Then he turned off the flashlight and shrugged. "Nothing. Just messing with you guys." The tension broke as everyone groaned and threw things at him. But I noticed something he didn't say. When he turned off the flashlight, he didn't look at me. He looked at the ground, avoiding my eyes. That night, as we climbed into our tents, a strange feeling lingered. I lay on my back, staring up at the thin fabric above me, listening to the sounds or lack thereof outside. Every so often I thought I heard something. A faint crack, like a branch breaking underfoot. A low whisper of movement through the leaves. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal passing by. But the feeling of unease stayed with me. I must have drifted off eventually, because the next thing I knew I was jolted awake by a sound. It was faint, but distinct. A low guttural noise that didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. I held my breath, listening, straining to hear it again. For a long moment there was nothing, and then from somewhere deep in the forest it came again. I wanted to wake the others to tell them what I'd heard, but something stopped me. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the irrational thought that if I stayed quiet, whatever it was wouldn't notice me. So I lay there, frozen, listening as the sound grew fainter and fainter until it finally disappeared. But even then I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us from the shadows. The night was colder than I'd expected, the chill seeping through the thin fabric of my sleeping bag. I wasn't sure what woke me at first, lying there with my heart thudding in the quiet. Then I heard it faint, distant, but distinct. A low, guttural sound that didn't belong in this forest or anywhere else I'd ever been. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The noise came again, a long, drawn-out growl that sent a shiver crawling up my spine. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of animal, maybe a coyote or a bear. But there was something unnatural about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Unable to ignore it any longer, I reached for the zipper of my tent, moving as quietly as I could. The sound of the zipper echoed louder than I'd intended, and I winced, pausing to listen. The noise had stopped, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. I pushed the flap open just enough to peek outside. The campfire had burned down to a faint glow, the embers casting a dim, flickering light across the clearing. The shadows of the trees seemed to stretch and shift as though alive. Then I saw it. Just beyond the edge of the clearing, where the light gave way to darkness, a shadow moved. It was quick, darting between the trees too fast for me to get a clear look. But the way it moved wasn't right. It was too deliberate, too smooth, as though it wasn't walking but gliding. I stared, my heart pounding in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to hide. But before I could pull the flap closed, a voice whispered behind me, startling me so badly I nearly screamed. "Did you hear that?" I spun around to see Jason crouched just outside his tent, his face pale in the faint light. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by a look of genuine fear. "Yeah," I whispered back. "I saw something too." Jason didn't respond right away. His eyes were fixed on the tree line, his body tense. "It's probably just an animal," he said, though his voice wavered. By now, the others had started to stir. One by one, they emerged from their tents, their faces etched with confusion and unease. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, rubbing her arms against the cold. "There's something out there," Jason said, his voice low. "What do you mean, something?" Mike asked, his tone skeptical. He shone his flashlight toward the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. "It's probably just a raccoon or something." "It's not a raccoon," I said. "It was bigger, and it moved weird like it wasn't walking." "Maybe it was a deer," Emily suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. The group fell silent, each of us straining to hear something, anything. For a long moment there was nothing but the crackle of the dying embers and the sound of our breathing. Then, from the darkness, it came again. The growl. This time it was louder, closer, and it sent a wave of fear rippling through the group. "What the hell was that?" Rachel whispered, clutching the edge of her hoodie. "I don't know," Jason said, his voice trembling. He held up his flashlight, his hand shaking as he aimed it at the trees. The beam of light flickered as it passed over the shadows. For a moment we saw nothing. Then, just as the flashlight began to dip, something moved. A shape emerged from the darkness, just for a split second. It was tall and hunched, its limbs impossibly long, its glowing eyes reflecting the light like two burning embers. "Holy crap," Jason hissed, stumbling back. "Turn it off," Sarah whispered harshly, grabbing Jason's arm. "Turn the flashlight off." "Why?" Mike asked, his voice rising. "Just do it," she snapped. Jason fumbled with the flashlight, his hands trembling, and the clearing was plunged back into near darkness. We stood there, frozen, listening as the sound of rustling leaves echoed from the trees. Whatever it was moving, circling us. "What do we do?" Emily asked, her voice barely audible. "Stay together," Sarah said firmly, though I could hear the fear in her tone. "We can't split up." Jason nodded, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. "If it comes closer, we'll scare it off." But we all knew how hollow his words were. Whatever was out there wasn't going to be scared off easily. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The growls and rustling continued, growing fainter before suddenly stopping altogether. The silence that followed was almost worse. It felt heavy, oppressive, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Maybe it's gone." "Yeah," Mike said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Probably got bored and wandered off." None of us moved. We stayed huddled together near the dying embers of the fire, our eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. "I think we should keep watch," I said quietly, "just in case." Jason nodded. "Good idea. We'll take shifts, 2 people at a time." We reluctantly agreed, splitting into pairs and settling in for a long, uneasy night. As I sat there with Jason, staring out into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not just by the creature, but by the forest itself. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The second night was worse, much worse. Whatever had haunted us the first night didn't just disappear with the dawn. It lingered, its presence hanging over us like a shadow we couldn't shake. The day passed in a strange, tense haze. None of us mentioned what had happened the night before, but it was clear we were all thinking about it. Even Jason, usually the first to crack a joke, was quieter than usual. We stuck closer together, venturing only a short distance from the clearing to gather firewood or stretch our legs. By the time night fell again, the unease had settled deep in my chest, making it hard to breathe. I told myself we'd been imagining things, that it was just the darkness and our overactive imaginations playing tricks on us. But deep down, I knew better. We were gathered around the campfire again, trying to act normal. Jason dealt out cards, Mike complained about the rules, and Emily laughed at Sarah's terrible poker face. It almost felt like things were back to normal. Almost. But even as we joked and played, my eyes kept drifting to the edge of the clearing. The trees loomed like a wall of shadows, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. The firelight didn't reach far enough to illuminate what lay beyond, and that darkness felt alive, as though it were watching us. That's when Sarah screamed. It wasn't the kind of scream you let out when you're startled or someone jumps out at you. It was raw, piercing, filled with terror. "What? What is it?" Jason demanded, dropping his cards. Sarah didn't answer. She just pointed, her hand trembling, toward the edge of the clearing. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. We all turned to look. At first, I didn't see anything. The firelight flickered and danced, casting shadows that made it hard to tell what was real. But then, just beyond the light's reach, I saw it. It was tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, and hunched over as though it couldn't stand upright. Its skin was leathery and stretched tight over its bones, giving it a gaunt, skeletal appearance. Its arms were too long, the fingers ending in claws that looked sharp enough to tear through flesh. But it was the eyes that struck me the most, 2 glowing yellow orbs that pierced through the darkness, locking onto us with an intensity that made my blood run cold. It didn't move like an animal or a person. It was slow, deliberate, its head tilting unnaturally as it studied us. The way it moved was wrong, as though it didn't fully understand how to use its own limbs. "Oh my God," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment, none of us moved. We just sat there, frozen, staring at the creature as it stared back at us. Then Jason snapped out of it. "Get something. Anything," he shouted, scrambling to his feet. The sudden movement seemed to startle the creature. It let out a low, guttural growl that I could feel in my chest, vibrating through the air like the hum of an engine. We scrambled for anything we could find. Jason grabbed a stick from the fire, its end glowing with embers. Mike had a flashlight which he shone directly at the creature. Sarah clutched a rock, her knuckles white as she held it up like a weapon. But before we could do anything, the creature moved. It didn't lunge or charge. It didn't roar or snarl. It simply disappeared. One moment it was there, its glowing eyes locked onto us, and the next it was gone. The darkness swallowed it whole, leaving nothing behind but the faint rustling of leaves, as though the forest itself was alive. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the pounding of my own heart. "Where did it go?" Rachel finally whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know," Jason said, still holding the burning stick like a sword. He turned in a slow circle, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Did anyone see it leave?" "No," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It just vanished." "That's not possible," Mike said, his flashlight beam sweeping the tree line. It's gotta be out there somewhere. Things don't just disappear. Maybe it does, Emily said, her voice shaking. Maybe it's not normal. None of us wanted to admit it, but we all knew she was right. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just an animal. It wasn't something we could explain away with logic or reason. We spent the rest of the night huddled around the fire, too afraid to go back into our tents. Every sound, every flicker of movement in the shadows made us jump. At one point, Jason swore he saw it again, lurking at the edge of the clearing. But when we shone the flashlight, there was nothing there. "It's messing with us," he muttered, his jaw clenched. "It's trying to scare us." "Well, it's working," Sarah snapped. The hours dragged on, the tension in the air so thick it was hard to breathe. By the time the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, we were all exhausted, our nerves frayed to the breaking point. But even as the sunlight filled the clearing, chasing away the shadows, the fear didn't leave. It stayed with us, a gnawing sense of dread that told us the worst was yet to come. The days that followed its first appearance were nothing short of a waking nightmare. We tried to convince ourselves that maybe it had gone, that it had just been a fluke, a rare and terrifying encounter we would never face again. But deep down, we all knew the truth. It was still there, watching, waiting. The evidence was impossible to ignore. It started small. On the morning after the creature vanished into the woods, Sarah found something on the tree near her tent. 3 long, jagged claw marks, deep enough to peel back the bark and reveal the pale wood beneath. "Guys, look at this," she called out, her voice shaking. We gathered around the tree, staring in silence. The claw marks were about a foot long, each one spaced far apart, as if made by a hand or a paw much larger than any animal we'd ever seen. Jason frowned, running his fingers over the grooves. "It's probably just a bear," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Bears don't come this close to people," Mike argued. "And even if they did, they wouldn't just leave a mark like this and wander off. They'd tear into the tents, the food, everything." "Well, maybe it's a prank," Jason suggested, though his voice wavered. "Someone trying to scare us." "Who?" Sarah snapped. "There's no one else out here." The truth hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. By the second night, the claw marks weren't the only sign of its presence. We'd stored our food supplies in a sealed plastic bin, tucked safely under one of the tents. When we woke up the next morning, the bin was shredded, the contents scattered across the clearing. Empty wrappers, torn bags of chips, and even cans with deep puncture marks littered the ground. "What the hell?" Emily muttered, staring at the mess. "Okay, now this is definitely not a bear," Mike said, holding up a can with jagged holes punched through it. "No bear does this." Jason was quiet, his usual bravado replaced by a tense silence. He kicked at one of the torn wrappers, muttering under his breath, "This thing's playing with us." Sarah nodded, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "It's not just trying to scare us, it's trying to starve us." By the third night, the creature upped the ante. It started with small noises in the woods, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, always just far enough away that we couldn't see anything. Every time we shone a flashlight toward the sound, there was nothing there. But then, it began mimicking us. It started with Sarah. We were all sitting by the fire, the flames burning low as we tried to keep the night at bay. The conversation had died hours ago, replaced by uneasy silence. Suddenly, from the direction of the woods, we heard her voice. "Hey, come here." "Hun." We froze. Sarah was sitting right next to me, her face pale as a sheet. "What was that?" she whispered. "Sounded like you," Jason said, his voice low. "It wasn't me," Sarah hissed. "I didn't say anything." The voice called out again, fainter this time. "Guys, over here. I found something." A chill ran down my spine. It sounded just like her, same tone, same pitch, but the words were off, like someone repeating a line they'd overheard. "It's trying to lure us out," Mike said, gripping the flashlight tighter. Jason stood up, his fists clenched. "Well, it's not going to work." That night, it was my turn. I woke up to the sound of someone calling my name. "Hey," the voice whispered. "Come here." I opened my eyes, my heart pounding. The voice was coming from outside my tent. "Come on, it's important." It was Sarah's voice, but something about it was wrong. It was too flat, too emotionless, like a recording played back on a broken speaker. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside. The campfire had long since burned out, and the clearing was bathed in moonlight. The others were all asleep, their tents zipped up tight. And then I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees, her back to me. "Sarah," I whispered. She didn't move. Oh. Something in the pit of my stomach told me not to go to her, not to leave the safety of the tent. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward her. The beam hit the spot where she was standing, but there was no one there. She was gone. The next morning, I told the others what had happened. "That wasn't me," Sarah said firmly, her face pale. "I didn't leave my tent last night. I swear." "We know," Jason said, his jaw clenched. "It's not just messing with us anymore. It's trying to split us up." Rachel nodded, her hands trembling as she held her coffee cup. "It wants us to be alone. Vulnerable." "We can't let it," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "From now on, we stick together. No one leaves the group for any reason." But the creature wasn't done. Over the next few nights, it escalated. It mimicked all of us, calling out from the woods in voices that sounded eerily perfect but were just off. Sometimes it used words we'd actually said earlier in the day, repeating them like a parrot. Other times it strung together random phrases, as though it was trying to learn how to speak. Once it even laughed, a low, distorted sound that sent shivers down my spine. By the fourth night, none of us were sleeping. We sat around the fire in a tight circle, clutching whatever we could use as weapons and jumping at every sound. "It's wearing us down," Jason said, his voice hoarse. "It's trying to break us." "Well, it's working," Mike muttered, his hands shaking as he gripped the flashlight. "No," Sarah said firmly. "We're not giving it what it wants. We're staying together, and we're getting out of here tomorrow. All of us." We nodded, though none of us truly believed her. By the fifth night, we were at our breaking point. The creature had pushed us to the edge, and fear was no longer our only emotion. We were angry, frustrated, and desperate to take control of the situation. Mike was the first to snap. "We can't just sit here and wait for it to pick us off," he said, pacing back and forth near the fire. His voice was louder than it should have been, and the tension in the air made every word feel like a challenge. "So what do you suggest?" Sarah asked, her arms crossed. She sounded tired, like the weight of the past few days had finally caught up to her. "We trap it," Mike said firmly. "We dig a pit, cover it with branches, and bait it with food. When it falls in, we finish it off." Jason snorted, shaking his head. And what happens if it doesn't work? What if it just climbs out? Mike glared at him. Do you have a better idea? Jason opened his mouth to reply, but Sarah cut him off. Enough, she said, her voice sharp. We don't have the luxury of arguing. If Mike has a plan, we're doing it. We have to do something. No one argued after that. We spent the next day preparing the trap. The work gave us something to focus on, a sense of purpose that distracted us from the creeping dread. Mike sketched out the plan in the dirt, a deep pit lined with sharp stakes at the bottom. It won't kill it, he admitted, but it'll slow it down, long enough for us to deal with it. We took turns digging the pit, each of us wielding makeshift tool sticks, rocks, anything we could find. The soil was hard and packed, and the work was exhausting. By the time the sun began to set, the pit was nearly 6 feet deep, jagged stakes protruding from the bottom like rows of teeth. We covered it with branches and leaves, spreading them carefully to make it look like solid ground. Finally, we placed the bait in the center of the trap, the remnants of our food supply, along with the shredded wrappers and cans the creature had already scavenged. As night fell, we sat around the fire, tense and silent. The plan was simple. We would wait for the creature to take the bait, and when it did, we would attack. The hours dragged by, each minute stretching into an eternity. Every sound, the crackle of the fire, the rustle of leaves set our nerves on edge. What if it doesn't come? Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. It'll come, Mike said, though he didn't sound as confident as he had earlier. And then it did. At first, we only heard it. The low, guttural growl that had haunted us every night, growing louder and closer. The shadows at the edge of the clearing seemed to shift, and the air grew heavy, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Get ready, Jason whispered, gripping the stick he'd sharpened into a crude spear. The creature stepped into the clearing, and for a moment, the sight of it stole the breath from my lungs. It was even more horrifying up close. Its leathery skin gleamed in the firelight, stretched so tightly over its bones that it looked as though it might tear. Its glowing yellow eyes scanned the clearing, and its long, clawed fingers twitched as it moved. It hesitated, sniffing the air, its head tilting unnaturally as it focused on the bait. Come on, Mike muttered under his breath. Take it. The creature moved closer, its movements slow and deliberate. It crouched low, its elongated limbs folding in ways that shouldn't have been possible, and reached for the bait. Then it fell. The branches gave way, and the creature let out a screech that made my ears ring as it plunged into the pit. The sound of its body hitting the stakes was sickening, a wet, crunching noise that made my stomach churn. For a moment, none of us moved. We did it, Sarah whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. We actually did it. But then the creature started to move. Its screeches turned into a deep, guttural growl as it thrashed in the pit, its claws scraping against the sides. The stakes had pierced its body, but it wasn't dying. If anything, it seemed angrier. What do we do now? Rachel asked, her voice rising in panic. Kill it, Jason shouted, grabbing a burning branch from the fire. Before any of us could stop him, he ran to the edge of the pit and threw the branch down. The flames caught quickly, licking at the creature's body as it thrashed and screamed. The sound was unbearable, a mix of rage and pain that seemed to echo through the entire forest. Jason stumbled back, breathing hard. It's done, he said, his voice shaking. We got it. We watched as the flames consumed the creature, its movements growing weaker until finally it stopped. "It's dead," Mike said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Just to be sure," Sarah said, "we bury it." It took hours to fill the pit, the smoke from the fire stinging our eyes and filling the air with the acrid stench of burning flesh. By the time we finished, the sun was beginning to rise, and we were all exhausted. We left the woods that morning, dragging ourselves back to the bus with a sense of grim satisfaction. We had survived. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I told myself it was over, that we had won. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of my mind whispering that it wasn't that simple. At first, everything seemed normal when we got home. We went back to our routines, pretending the nightmare in the woods was behind us. It was easy to believe we'd won. The creature was gone, or so we thought. For the first few days, I felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted off my chest. But there was still an unease that I couldn't shake, a quiet voice in the back of my mind whispering that it wasn't really over. I wasn't the only one who felt it. Jason was the first to notice something was wrong. He called me a week after we got back, his voice unusually serious. "Have you been hearing things?" he asked, his tone low and urgent. "What kind of things?" I replied, though I already knew what he was going to say. "Voices," he said, "at night, outside my window. They sound like you." A chill ran through me, but I forced a laugh, trying to brush it off. "It's probably just your imagination," I said. "We've been through a lot. It's messing with your head." "Yeah," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Maybe." But I knew Jason. He wasn't the type to scare easily, and the fear in his voice was real. 2 weeks after we left the woods, Jason disappeared. It happened on a Thursday. His parents thought he was staying at a friend's house. His friends thought he was home. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, he was already gone. The police searched his house, his neighborhood, the nearby woods, but there was no trace of him. No signs of a struggle, no clues. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. We all tried to stay in touch after that, calling and texting each other constantly. But as the days passed, the group began to unravel. Emily was next. She stopped answering calls, stopped responding to texts. Her parents thought she was staying with relatives in another city, but when they called to check, they found out she'd never arrived. By the time the police got involved, it was already too late. Like Jason, Emily was just gone. Rachel and Mike were terrified. Sarah and I tried to keep everyone calm, but it was hard to stay rational when our friends were vanishing one by one. "Do you think it's the creature?" Sarah asked one night, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted. "It doesn't make sense. We killed it. We buried it." "Did we?" she whispered, her eyes wide and haunted. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her we'd done everything right, but the truth was, I didn't believe it either. It wasn't until Sarah showed up at my house in the middle of the night that I truly understood. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The shadows in my room seemed darker than usual, the silence heavier. Then, there was a knock at my window. I froze, my heart racing. The knock came again, louder this time. I climbed out of bed and pulled back the curtain. Sarah was standing there, pale and trembling, her breath fogging up the glass. I opened the window, and she climbed in, clutching the jacket around her shoulders. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's still alive," she said, her voice shaking. "It let us think we killed it. It's playing with us." I stared at her, my stomach twisting into knots. "What are you talking about?" "I saw it," she said. "Outside my house. It was just standing there, watching me. And then it smiled." "Smiled?" I repeated, my voice trembling. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It's not human. It never was. It's something else, something that doesn't die the way we thought it would." We stayed up the rest of the night, piecing together everything we'd experienced. The claw marks, the food, the mimicry, it had all been part of a game, a sick, twisted game designed to break us. And when we thought we'd won, it let us believe we were safe, only to follow us home. "It's picking us off," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "One by one." "But why?" I asked. "Why not just kill us in the woods?" "Because it enjoys this," she said. "It enjoys watching us suffer, watching us fall apart. It doesn't just want us dead, it wants to destroy us." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The creature wasn't just a predator, it was something far worse. The next morning we called Rachel and Mike, but neither of them answered. Sarah and I drove to Rachel's house, only to find her parents panicking. She hadn't come home the night before, and her car was still in the driveway. Mike's house was the same. His parents were frantic, calling everyone they could think of, but there were no answers. It was just Sarah and me now. That night I stayed awake, every light in my house turned on, a baseball bat clutched tightly in my hands. Sarah slept on the couch, though her sleep was fitful, filled with murmured words and restless movements. Around 3 a.m., the noises started. It began with faint whispers just outside the windows. Then came the knocks, slow, deliberate, echoing through the house like a heartbeat. I stood in the middle of the living room, my heart pounding, as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "It's us," the voices said. "Let us in." They were familiar: Jason's voice, Emily's, Rachel's, Mike's. But they were wrong, distorted, like recordings played at the wrong speed. Sarah woke up, her eyes wide with terror. "It's here," she whispered. I nodded, gripping the bat tighter. The knocking stopped. The whispers faded. And then, from the darkness outside, came a sound I will never forget. Laughter. Low, guttural, and inhuman, it echoed through the night, filling the room with a cold, suffocating dread. "It's still playing with us," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "But it's not going to stop until it's finished." It was just Sarah and me now. The others, Jason, Emily, Rachel, Mike, were gone, their fates unknown. The weight of their absence hung heavy on us, a constant reminder that our time was running out. We couldn't sit and wait any longer. The creature was coming for us, and if we didn't find a way to stop it, we'd be next. We started with research, combing through every source we could find. It wasn't easy. Information about creatures like this wasn't exactly in textbooks or on the internet, but desperation has a way of sharpening your focus. Late one night, after hours of digging through obscure forums and folklore archives, Sarah came across something, a story buried in the pages of an old book about Appalachian legends. "It's not a creature," she said, her voice trembling as she read aloud. "At least, not in the way we think. It's a spirit, an entity, something ancient, something that feeds on fear." I leaned over her shoulder, scanning the page. The description matched our experience almost perfectly, an entity that lured its victims into isolation, feeding on their despair before ultimately consuming them. "But it's physical," I said, frowning. "We saw it. We trapped it. We burned it." "It's physical because it chooses to be," Sarah explained. "It can take on a form, but that's not its true self. Its power doesn't come from its body, it comes from us. From our fear, our pain." "So what are we supposed to do?" I asked, my voice tinged with frustration. "Stop being afraid." "That's impossible." Sarah shook her head. "We don't have to stop being afraid. We have to destroy what's giving it power. It's not just feeding on us, it's tied to us, to the fear we brought back from the woods." We spent the next few days piecing together every detail of our encounter, retracing our steps from the moment we arrived at the campsite to the moment we thought we'd killed it. The more we talked, the clearer the picture became. The creature hadn't chosen us at random. It was bound to the forest. Yes, but it had been waiting for the right kind of prey, someone who would fear it, someone who would carry that fear home. "That's why it let us think we killed it," Sarah said, her voice grim. "It wanted us to leave, to take it with us." The final piece of the puzzle came from an old article Sarah found in a local library. It described a series of disappearances in the same forest nearly 50 years ago. A group of hikers had gone missing, their bodies never found. The only clue was a journal left behind at their campsite, filled with descriptions of a creature eerily similar to ours. The last entry read, "It's not the body that matters. It's the shadow." "What does that mean?" I asked, staring at the words. Sarah frowned, deep in thought. "Maybe it's like the legend said, it's not just physical. Its body is just a form, but its real essence is something else, something intangible, a shadow." Armed with this new understanding, we formulated a plan. "We can't kill it with brute force," Sarah said. "We have to destroy its essence, its shadow. But to do that, we have to draw it out. We have to face it where it's strongest." "The forest," I said, my stomach sinking. She nodded. "Where it started, where it still has the most power." It was a terrifying prospect, but we knew it was the only way. We gathered supplies, flashlights, matches, salt, and a book of protective rituals Sarah had found in her research. We didn't know if they would work, but it was better than going in unarmed. As we drove back to the forest, the air grew heavier, the shadows deeper. The familiar sight of the towering trees brought a wave of nausea and fear, but we pushed forward. The clearing was just as we had left it, though the air felt colder, the silence more oppressive. The pit we dug was still there, filled in and overgrown, but it seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if the creature's presence still lingered. "We need to draw it out," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. We set up a perimeter of salt around the clearing, lit a small fire, and began reciting the ritual Sarah had found. The words felt strange on my tongue, heavy and ancient, as though they didn't belong in this world. At first, nothing happened. The forest remained still, the shadows unchanging. And then, the air shifted. The fire flickered, its flames bending unnaturally as the shadows around us seemed to thicken. The creature emerged from the darkness, its form even more grotesque than before. Its glowing yellow eyes locked onto us, and its mouth twisted into a hideous grin. "You came back," it hissed, its voice a chilling blend of human and inhuman tones. "How thoughtful." "We're not afraid of you," Sarah said, though her trembling hands betrayed her. The creature laughed, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "You lie so beautifully," it said, taking a step closer. "Your fear tastes sweeter than ever." It lunged at us, its claws slicing through the air, but the salt barrier held. The creature screeched in frustration, its body writhing as it tried to break through. "Now," Sarah shouted. I grabbed a container of salt and threw it into the fire. The flames roared, turning an unnatural blue as the creature let out a deafening scream. Its form flickered, shifting between solid and shadow, as though it were struggling to maintain its shape. "Keep going," Sarah yelled, reciting the ritual louder, her voice steady despite the chaos around us. The creature's body began to dissolve, its screams echoing through the clearing as its shadow detached from its form. "There," Sarah shouted, pointing to the shadow as it writhed on the ground like a living thing. I grabbed a torch from the fire and plunged it into the shadow. It let out one final, ear-piercing shriek before disappearing entirely, leaving only silence in its wake. We stood there, trembling as the fire burned low. The oppressive weight that had hung over the clearing was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Sarah nodded, though she didn't look entirely convinced. "For now," she said. "But something like that, it doesn't die easily." The final confrontation began exactly where it had started, deep in the cursed woods. By now, Sarah and I knew what we were walking into, and the weight of that knowledge pressed down on us as we stepped past the tree line. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig, felt like the prelude to something sinister. This time we weren't running. We had come to finish what we started, to put an end to the nightmare that had already taken so much from us. The lair wasn't hard to find. We followed the clues we'd pieced together from our research, retracing our steps and focusing on the places where we'd felt its presence the strongest. It was as though the forest was guiding us, leading us deeper into its twisted heart. The air grew colder the farther we went, the trees becoming more gnarled and ancient. Their branches reached out like skeletal fingers, forming a canopy so dense that even the midday sun struggled to penetrate. And then we saw it. In the center of a small clearing stood a tree unlike any I'd ever seen. It was massive, its trunk twisted and blackened as though it had been struck by lightning. The bark was covered in deep grooves that resembled claw marks, and at its base, the ground was littered with bones, animal and otherwise. "This is it," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The air around the tree seemed to pulse with a dark energy, a tangible malevolence that made my skin crawl. We set to work immediately. We doused the base of the tree with gasoline, the pungent smell cutting through the damp, earthy air. Every movement felt sluggish, as though the forest itself was trying to resist us. As I struck the match, a sudden wind swept through the clearing, howling like a chorus of whispers. The flames caught quickly, climbing up the tree with an unnatural intensity. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The ground beneath us trembled, and the shadows around the clearing began to shift and writhe. The creature emerged from the base of the tree, its form more terrifying than ever. It was larger now, its limbs elongated and twisted in unnatural ways. Its glowing yellow eyes burned brighter, and its skin seemed to pulse and ripple as though alive. The air around it shimmered with heat, distorting its outline and making it seem even more otherworldly. "You think fire will stop me?" it hissed, its voice a mix of anger and amusement. "We know it will," Sarah said, stepping forward. Her voice was steady, but I could see the fear in her eyes. The creature snarled, lunging toward us with terrifying speed, but this time we didn't run. I grabbed the torch we had prepared and swung it toward the creature, the flames forcing it to retreat. Sarah began chanting the ritual, her voice rising above the creature's growls. The fire continued to climb the tree, black smoke billowing into the sky. The creature screamed, its form flickering and distorting as though the flames were hurting it. But it wasn't going down without a fight. The creature lashed out, its claws slicing through the air. One of them caught my arm, and a searing pain shot through me as I stumbled back. "Keep going," Sarah shouted, her voice breaking. I gritted my teeth, holding the torch up to keep the creature at bay. Sarah's chanting grew louder, each word seeming to resonate with the fire's intensity. The flames reached the top of the tree, and the creature let out a deafening scream that made the ground shake. Its body began to disintegrate, pieces of it falling away like ash in the wind. For a moment, we thought it was over. The creature collapsed to the ground, its form crumbling into a pile of ash. The fire burned itself out, leaving the tree charred and lifeless. Sarah and I stood there, breathing heavily, our bodies trembling with exhaustion and relief. "We did it," Sarah said, her voice shaky. But as I stared at the pile of ash, a nagging feeling crept over me. Something wasn't right. Before I could say anything, the ash began to move. It swirled and twisted, rising into the air like smoke. The shadows in the clearing deepened, and a cold wind swept through, extinguishing our torches. "No," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with dread. The ash coalesced into a new form, taller and more horrifying than before. Its eyes burned brighter, and its mouth twisted into a cruel smile. "You thought you could destroy me," it said, its voice echoing like 1,000 whispers. "You only made me stronger." We realized then that we hadn't destroyed it. We had only freed it from its tether to the tree, allowing it to take on a new, more powerful form. Panic set in as the creature advanced, its presence overwhelming. "What do we do?" Sarah screamed, clutching my arm. "We need to finish the ritual," I shouted, fumbling for the book. The creature let out a roar, its claws slicing through the air as it lunged toward us. I shoved Sarah out of the way, barely dodging its attack. With trembling hands, I opened the book and began chanting, the words spilling from my lips in a desperate rush. The creature writhed, its form flickering and distorting as the ritual took hold. Sarah joined in, her voice steadying as she recited the words. The air around us seemed to shimmer, the shadows retreating as a blinding light filled the clearing. The creature let out one final, ear-piercing scream as its body dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind only silence. We stood there, the light fading, the forest returning to its eerie stillness. "Is it gone?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I didn't know. As we made our way out of the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us, lurking just beyond the edge of the trees. And when we finally reached the safety of the road, I turned back one last time. In the distance, I thought I saw two glowing yellow eyes staring back at me. Weeks passed after that night in the woods. Sarah and I did everything we could to return to some semblance of normalcy, but nothing felt the same. The world outside seemed brighter, safer, but it was an illusion. Deep down, we both knew we'd left a piece of ourselves in that forest, and whatever had happened there wasn't truly behind us. At first, there were no signs. No growls in the night, no whispers outside the window, no strange shadows moving where they shouldn't. For the first time in what felt like forever, I began to believe we'd won. I let myself relax, let my guard down. That was my first mistake. It was late one evening, and I was sitting on my couch, scrolling mindlessly through my phone. Sarah had moved in with a distant aunt in another town, needing to put as much distance between herself and the forest as possible. We still talked every day, sharing updates and trying to keep each other sane, but the calls were shorter now, our conversations punctuated by long, uneasy silences. That night my phone buzzed with a new message. I glanced at the screen, expecting it to be Sarah. It wasn't. The number was familiar, though it took me a moment to place it. When I did, my stomach dropped. It was Jason's number. Jason, who had disappeared weeks ago. Jason, who was gone. My hand trembled as I opened the message. It was just 4 words. It's not over yet. For a moment I couldn't move. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this some kind of sick joke? Had someone found Jason's phone and decided to use it to mess with me? Or was it something worse? Before I could think it through, another message appeared. Did you miss me? My breath caught in my throat. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper. I typed out a reply with shaky fingers. Who is this? The response came almost immediately. You know who. Who? I dropped the phone and backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. My ears began to ring, and for a moment, I thought I heard laughter, low, guttural, and inhuman. I grabbed the phone and called Sarah. She picked up on the second ring, her voice groggy and irritated. What's going on? She asked. It's late. It's back, I said, my voice trembling. It's Jason's number. It just texted me. There was a long pause on the other end. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. You're sure it's his number? Positive, I said. I don't know how, but it's him or it's pretending to be him. Sarah arrived at my house the next morning, pale and shaken. She hadn't slept, and it was clear the news had hit her as hard as it had me. We underestimated it, she said, pacing back and forth in my living room. We thought we destroyed it, but we didn't. It's smarter than we gave it credit for. So what do we do? I asked, my voice filled with desperation. How do we fight something that doesn't die? I don't know, she admitted, sinking into a chair. But we need to find out. If it's reaching out to you, it means it's not done with us. Over the next few days, the messages continued. They came at random times, always from Jason's number, and they weren't just threats. They were personal. The creature, whatever it was, knew things about me, things I had never told anyone. Do you remember the first night? One message read, when you heard the growl and stayed quiet. You thought that would save you. Another, Sarah's brave, isn't she? But bravery won't help her. Each message felt like a dagger, twisting deeper into my psyche. I tried blocking the number, changing my phone, but nothing worked. The messages always found their way back to me. One night, Sarah and I sat in my living room, surrounded by books and notes from our previous research. The air was thick with tension, neither of us speaking as we pored over the pages, looking for anything that might help us. Wait, Sarah said suddenly, her finger tracing a line in one of the books. This might be it. She showed me the passage, an old legend about spirits that could anchor themselves to the living. According to the text, these entities could mimic voices, take on forms, and even influence thoughts. The only way to sever the connection was to confront the spirit in its own domain, its true domain. The forest wasn't its home, Sarah said, her voice filled with realization. It was a doorway, a place where it could cross into our world, but its real essence, it's somewhere else. Where? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah pointed to a section of the text. A liminal space, she read. A realm between life and death, light and shadow. To destroy it, we have to go there. The thought of entering this liminal space terrified me, but there was no other choice. If we didn't end this once and for all, the creature would keep coming, dragging us and anyone else it chose into its nightmare. We began preparing for what felt like a final battle. We gathered supplies, candles, mirrors, salt, and symbols we had learned from the rituals. The passage was clear. The creature thrived on despair, but it could be weakened by turning its own power against it. The mirrors will reflect its true form, Sarah explained, her voice trembling but determined. The salt will create a barrier, and the candles, they'll light our way. The night we performed the ritual to enter the liminal space, the air was thick with tension. We drew a circle of salt in the center of my living room, placing mirrors at each cardinal direction. The candles flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. As we began the chant, the room grew colder. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe. Then, with a sudden whoosh, the candles extinguished, plunging us into darkness. When the light returned, we weren't in my living room anymore. The space around us was unrecognizable. The ground was a dull, lifeless gray, stretching out endlessly in all directions. The sky above was dark, filled with swirling clouds that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Shadows danced along the horizon, flickering and shifting, always just out of reach. And then we saw it. The creature stood in the distance, its form more horrifying than ever. It was no longer bound by the limitations of a physical body. It was fluid, ever-changing, a mass of darkness and glowing yellow eyes that watched us with malevolent glee. "You've come so far," it said, its voice echoing in the empty space. "But this is where it ends." The final battle was chaos. The creature lashed out with tendrils of shadow, each one filled with an unbearable cold. Sarah and I fought back with everything we had, using the mirrors to reflect its form and the salt to hold it at bay. But it was clever. It whispered our fears, our doubts, trying to break our resolve. "You can't win," it hissed. "You're mine." In the end, it was Sarah who figured out the key. "It's the light," she screamed. "It hates the light." We lit the candles again, their flames brighter than before, and the creature screamed, its form unraveling as the light consumed it. But as it faded, it let out one final laugh. "This isn't over," it whispered, its voice lingering even as its body dissolved. "I'll always find you." Weeks later, I received a message from Jason's number. "It's not over yet." And that's when I realized we had underestimated it again. The message from Jason's number shattered what little piece Sarah and I had managed to rebuild. For weeks we had tried to convince ourselves that the creature was gone, that we had banished it for good. We clung to that belief like a lifeline, using it to push through the sleepless nights and lingering unease. But now, staring at those 4 words, "It's not over yet," I felt the ground shift beneath me. It wasn't just a warning. It was a taunt. I stared at the screen, my fingers trembling as I tried to process what I was seeing. Jason's number was impossible to ignore, etched into my memory like a scar. But Jason was gone. He'd disappeared weeks ago, taken by the very thing we thought we had destroyed. "Maybe it's a prank," Sarah said when I showed her the message, though the fear in her eyes betrayed her words. "A prank?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Who would do something like this? Who even could?" She didn't answer. We both knew the truth. At first, we tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had found Jason's phone. Maybe it had been stolen before he disappeared. Maybe, just maybe, this was all some cruel joke, a sick coincidence that had nothing to do with the creature. But then the signs started. It began with scratches on my bedroom window. They appeared one night out of nowhere, long and jagged, as though something had clawed at the glass in frustration. At first I thought it was an animal, a stray cat, maybe, but the marks were too deep, too deliberate. The next night, I heard noises outside my house. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves or the creak of a branch. But then the sounds grew louder, more distinct. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth beneath my window. I peered through the curtains, my heart pounding in my chest. The yard was empty, bathed in the pale glow of the street lamp. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. The worst came a few nights later. I was lying in bed, trying and failing to fall asleep, when I heard a voice, faint and familiar, calling my name. "Hey," it whispered, "come here." My blood ran cold. It was Jason's voice. At first I thought it might be a dream, a trick of my sleep-deprived mind. But then it came again, louder this time. "Come on, I need to talk to you." I sat up, my heart pounding, and stared at the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of something or someone standing just outside. "Jason," I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. I climbed out of bed and approached the window, my hands shaking as I pulled back the curtain. But when I looked outside, there was no one there. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The voice came again, this time from behind me. "Don't you trust me?" I turned, my back pressed against the cold glass, but the room was empty. When I told Sarah what had happened, she didn't seem surprised. "It's not just you," she said quietly. "I've been hearing things too. Footsteps outside my house. Voices calling my name. It's like it's trying to remind us that it's still here." "What does it want?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "It wants us to break," Sarah said. "It wants us to fall apart, to give up." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This thing wasn't just a threat to us anymore, it could go after anyone. It was playing with us, yes, but it wasn't bound to us. The fear we'd carried out of the woods had given it strength, and now it was free to roam, free to find new prey. We couldn't let that happen. "We have to stop it," I said. Sarah nodded, though her face was pale. "How?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But we have to figure it out. We can't let it hurt anyone else." We started researching again, digging deeper than we ever had before. Every piece of folklore, every story about spirits or entities, every scrap of information we could find, we studied it all, looking for anything that might give us an edge. It was during one of these late-night sessions that we stumbled across something new. "It's stronger now," Sarah said, scanning an old, yellowed page in a book she'd found online. It's not just feeding on fear, it's spreading it. That's why it's reaching out to us, why it's taunting us. It's using us to grow stronger. So we have to cut it off, I said. Starve it. But how? Sarah asked. By confronting it, I said, though the thought made my stomach churn. We have to face it head on. Force it back to wherever it came from. The idea was terrifying, but it was the only option. We began preparing for one final confrontation, gathering every tool we thought might help: salt, mirrors, candles, and a book of rituals we had found in our research. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was exactly what it wanted. The night we planned to act, the creature made its boldest move yet. As we sat in Sarah's living room, surrounded by our supplies, my phone buzzed with another message. This time it wasn't from Jason's number. It was from Sarah's. "Come outside. I need you." I looked up at Sarah, who was sitting across from me. Her phone was on the table, untouched. We stared at each other, the color draining from her face. "It's here," she whispered. The creature wasn't just toying with us anymore. It was pushing us to the brink, forcing us to confront it on its terms. As the whispers began to fill the room, I realized we didn't have much time. We had to act fast, or we wouldn't survive the night. Sarah and I locked ourselves in her apartment for what felt like days, determined to uncover the truth about the creature. The whispers, the scratches, the messages, they were all part of a puzzle we didn't yet understand. But one thing was clear: it wasn't just tied to the woods. It was tied to us. We turned her living room into a makeshift war room. Books, old newspapers, and printouts covered every surface, along with hastily scribbled notes and diagrams that we hoped would lead to a solution. The air was thick with tension, our nerves frayed as we sifted through the fragments of knowledge we'd collected. The deeper we dug, the more horrifying the truth became. Every story, every legend we uncovered described creatures that fed on fear, but this one was different. It wasn't just a predator, it was a parasite. It didn't die in the fire because we never destroyed the source of its power, Sarah said, pacing back and forth with a book in her hands. "The woods?" I asked, though I knew the answer wasn't that simple. Sarah shook her head. "No. It's not the woods, it's us. It's feeding on us, on the fear we carried out of there." She paused, flipping through the book until she found a passage marked with a sticky note. "Look at this." She handed me the book, pointing to a section about parasitic spirits. The description sent a chill down my spine. These entities attach themselves to the living, drawing strength from their memories, fears, and pain. To sever the connection, one must confront the root of their fear, forcing the entity to weaken and retreat. It all made sense now. The creature hadn't just followed us home, it had become part of us. It was why the fire hadn't worked, why the rituals had only slowed it down. We hadn't confronted it, we tried to run from it, to bury it. "We need to face it," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Not just the creature, but everything. Everything it's used against us." "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me already knew. She took a deep breath. "Our worst memories. The things we've been trying to forget since we left the woods. That's how it's staying connected to us. It's using those memories, those fears, as a bridge." Confronting our worst memories wasn't something either of us wanted to do, but we didn't have a choice. If we didn't face them, the creature would keep growing stronger. And if it wasn't stopped, it would eventually move on to others. We started by writing everything down, every detail we could remember from the woods, no matter how small or insignificant it seemed. The growls, the claw marks, the voices, the mimicry. We relived every terrifying moment, forcing ourselves to confront the things we'd been trying to push out of our minds. "It's more than just the woods," Sarah said one night, staring at a piece of paper where she'd scribbled down her memories. "It's everything we brought into the woods with us. Our fears, our insecurities, it's using all of it." She was right. The creature hadn't just fed on the fear we felt in the forest, it had latched onto the fears we'd carried with us long before we ever stepped foot in those cursed woods. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. "It's not just about the memories," I said, my voice shaking. "It's about control. It's been controlling us from the start, using our fears to manipulate us." Sarah nodded. "And if we want to destroy it, we have to take that control back." We spent the next few days preparing for the confrontation. It wasn't just about gathering supplies, it was about mentally and emotionally preparing ourselves to face the creature head-on. We practiced the rituals, memorized the chants, and rehearsed the steps we would take once we were back in the woods. But more importantly, we confronted the memories it had been using against us. For me, it was the memory of Jason's voice calling my name, the way it had mimicked him so perfectly. I had to remind myself that it wasn't Jason, it had never been Jason. It was the creature, manipulating me, using my guilt and fear against me. For Sarah, it was the memory of the night she saw the creature standing outside her house, smiling at her. "It wanted me to think it was inevitable," she said. "Like there was nothing I could do to stop it. But that was a lie." The turning point came when we found a passage in one of the oldest books we'd uncovered. It described a ritual not for banishment, but for severance, cutting the ties that bound a parasitic entity to its host. The ritual was complex, requiring symbols, mirrors, and fire, as well as the participation of all those connected to the entity. "That's us," Sarah said, tracing the instructions with her finger. "We're the hosts. If we do this, it'll sever its connection to us and force it back into the shadows. But it says here we have to do it where the bond was created," I pointed out, my stomach sinking. "The woods," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Returning to the woods felt like walking into a nightmare. The memories came flooding back with every step, the shadows and sounds triggering a visceral fear I could barely keep in check. But this time, we were prepared. We found the clearing where it had all begun, the place where we'd first camped, first seen the creature. The air was heavy with the same oppressive energy we'd felt that night, but this time we didn't let it control us. We set up the ritual, marking the ground with salt and drawing the symbols we'd memorized. The mirrors were positioned to reflect the flames of the fire, creating an endless loop of light meant to weaken the creature's form. As we began the chant, the forest seemed to come alive. The wind howled, the trees creaked, and the shadows began to shift and writhe. The creature appeared almost immediately, its form larger and more grotesque than ever. Its glowing yellow eyes burned with fury, and its voice was a guttural snarl as it spoke. "You cannot win," it hissed. "I am a part of you." "No," Sarah said, her voice steady. "You're a parasite, and we're cutting you off." The creature lunged, but it couldn't cross the barrier of salt. It thrashed and screamed as the ritual continued, its form flickering and distorting. The final step required us to confront our memories one last time, to speak them aloud and release them. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," I said, my voice trembling but firm. You used Jason's voice to control me, but he's gone, and I'm not carrying that guilt anymore. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes locked on the creature. You made me feel powerless, but I'm not. I'm taking that power back. The creature let out a final, deafening scream as its form dissolved into the shadows. The mirrors shattered, the flames roared, and then silence. For the first time in weeks, the forest felt still. We did it, Sarah said, her voice trembling with relief. But as we turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly gone. We didn't want to go back. Not after everything that had happened, not after the creature had taken so much from us. But the choice wasn't ours anymore. It was either face the nightmare head on or let it consume us and others forever. This time we came armed. We had spent weeks preparing, gathering everything we thought we'd need: ritual texts, talismans meant to weaken the creature, symbols of protection. It felt almost ridiculous, like a desperate shot in the dark. But deep down, we knew it was our only hope. The journey back to the woods felt surreal, like stepping into a memory you tried to forget. The road leading to the forest seemed longer this time, the air colder, heavier. Every mile brought a new wave of dread, but none of us said a word. It was just Sarah, Rachel, and me now. Mike and Emily were gone, lost to the creature's twisted game. We couldn't risk involving anyone else, not that we would have known who to ask. This fight was ours, and ours alone. As we crossed the threshold into the forest, the change was immediate. The trees seemed darker, their branches twisting together to block out the sun. The air was thick, humid, and suffocating, carrying a faint metallic scent that reminded me of blood. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. "It's like it's been waiting for us," Sarah whispered, clutching the bag of supplies tightly against her chest. "It knows we're here," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "It's watching us." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. We all felt it, the oppressive presence that seemed to follow us with every step. We retraced our steps to the clearing where it all began. The sight of it hit me like a punch to the gut. The clearing, once alive with the laughter and energy of our group, was now overgrown and lifeless. The grass was brittle and brown, the trees around it twisted and gnarled. The air felt colder here, as though the clearing itself was rejecting life. And there it was, the pit. The place where we had made our first fatal mistake. The pit was still there, a haunting reminder of our failure. The ground around it was uneven, the dirt we'd used to fill it in now cracked and disturbed. It looked as though something had been clawing its way out. "We thought we'd killed it," I said quietly, staring at the pit. "We didn't know what we were dealing with," Sarah replied. "No," Rachel said, her voice sharp. "We knew. We just didn't want to believe it." The first step was setting up the ritual. We worked quickly, marking the ground with salt and drawing the symbols we'd memorized. The clearing was our battleground, and every detail mattered. The mirrors were placed at precise angles, meant to reflect the firelight and trap the creature's shadow. Candles were arranged in a circle, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the ground. The air grew heavier as we worked, the oppressive energy pressing down on us like a weight. Every so often I thought I heard whispers, faint and distorted, carried on the wind. "It's testing us," Sarah said, lighting the last candle. "It's trying to scare us." "Well, it's working," Rachel muttered, glancing nervously at the shadows. As night fell, the atmosphere in the clearing grew even darker. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The pit, once a crude and hasty trap, now felt like a gateway to something far worse. "It's time," Sarah said, her voice steady but laced with fear. We stood in a circle, clutching the talismans and preparing ourselves for what was to come. The ritual was simple in theory, but every step felt monumental. We had to chant the incantation, confront our fears, and force the creature to reveal its true form. If we faltered, even for a moment, we knew it would take us. The chanting began. The words felt strange and heavy on my tongue, as though they didn't belong in this world. The air around us seemed to ripple, the shadows growing darker and more defined. And then it appeared. The creature emerged from the pit, its form more grotesque than ever. It was larger now, its limbs impossibly long and twisted. Its glowing yellow eyes burned with malice, and its leathery skin pulsed and shifted as though it were alive. It moved with an unnatural grace, its body seeming to defy the laws of physics. "You came back," it hissed, its voice a guttural snarl that seemed to vibrate in my chest. "How thoughtful." The creature lunged, but the salt barrier held. It screamed in frustration, its claws scraping against the invisible boundary. "Keep chanting," Sarah yelled, her voice cutting through the chaos. We recited the words louder, our voices overlapping as the creature thrashed and writhed. The fire in the center of the clearing roared, its flames turning an unnatural shade of blue. The creature's form began to flicker, shifting between solid and shadow. Its eyes burned brighter, and its voice grew louder, a cacophony of screams and distorted whispers. "You cannot win," it snarled. "I am a part of you." "No," Sarah said, stepping forward. "You're a parasite, and we're cutting you off." The creature let out a deafening scream as the ritual reached its climax. The mirrors shattered, their shards reflecting fragments of the creature's form as it began to dissolve. The candles flickered and died, plunging the clearing into darkness. And then silence. For a moment, none of us moved. The oppressive energy that had filled the clearing was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. "Is it over?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. "I think so," Sarah replied, though she didn't sound convinced. I stared at the pit, my stomach churning. The creature was gone, but the shadows around the clearing still felt wrong. As we packed up our supplies and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The forest felt alive, its silence filled with unspoken threats. As we crossed the threshold out of the woods, I turned back one last time. In the distance, near the edge of the clearing, two glowing yellow eyes stared back at me. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest transformed. The air grew thick and heavy, carrying a strange, metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. The trees, once imposing but lifeless, seemed to shift and lean toward us, their twisted branches casting grotesque shadows in the fading light. "This feels different," Sarah said, her voice barely audible over the oppressive silence. "It's stronger," Rachel added, clutching a talisman tightly to her chest. "It knows we're here." We were back in the clearing, the site of our first and second failures. The pit was still there, a silent reminder of our mistakes, but now it looked more like a wound, a festering scar on the earth that refused to heal. We stood in a circle, the fire at our center casting faint light into the encroaching darkness. The talismans around our necks felt warm, almost alive, as if they were reacting to the energy surrounding us. "It's coming," I whispered, my voice trembling. The first sign was the wind, or rather, the lack of it. The air was completely still, yet the trees swayed as if caught in a violent storm. The shadows around the clearing stretched and twisted unnaturally, their movements disconnected from the firelight. Then we heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to resonate in our bones. It wasn't like the sounds we'd heard before. Those had been distant, haunting. This was close, deliberate, and filled with malice. The growl grew louder, and the shadows began to coalesce, gathering at the edge of the clearing. At first it was formless, a mass of darkness that seemed to writhe and pulsate. Then it began to take shape. The creature stepped into the light, and my breath caught in my throat. It was larger now, towering over us like a living nightmare. Its limbs were impossibly long and twisted, its skin leathery and glistening as though it had been burned. Bones jutted out at angles, and its hands ended in claws so sharp they seemed to glint even in the dim light. But it was its face, or what passed for a face, that sent a shiver of pure terror down my spine. Its eyes were glowing yellow, brighter and more intense than before, and they seemed to pierce straight into my soul. Its mouth was a gaping maw filled with jagged, uneven teeth, and as it opened, a black mist spilled out, evaporating into the air. It spoke, and its voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard. No longer a mimicry of ours, it was deep and guttural, carrying an echo that reverberated in my mind. "This is your fault," it hissed, each word dripping with venom. "You should have left me alone." The weight of its presence was unbearable. The air felt thick, as if it were trying to crush us where we stood. My legs trembled, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. "We're not afraid of you," Sarah said, though her voice wavered. The creature laughed, a sound that was both guttural and piercing, like the grinding of metal on metal. "Oh, but you are," it said, its eyes locking onto hers. "I can taste it. Every beat of your heart, every drop of sweat. Your fear is exquisite." It began to circle us, its movements slow and deliberate. Each step it took left scorch marks on the ground, the grass curling and blackening beneath its feet. "You thought you could kill me," it snarled, its gaze shifting to me. "You thought fire and rituals would be enough to banish me. Fools." I gripped the talisman around my neck, the warmth of it a small comfort against the overwhelming terror. "You're a parasite," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "You feed on fear because you're too weak to exist without it." The creature stopped, its head tilting unnaturally as it regarded me. "Weak," it repeated, its voice dripping with mockery. "Do I seem weak to you?" Suddenly, it lunged. Its clawed hand slashed through the air, aiming for my throat. I stumbled back, barely avoiding its attack, and the force of its movement sent a gust of wind through the clearing. "Hold the line," Sarah shouted, throwing salt at the creature. The grains hit its skin and sizzled, sending up small plumes of black smoke. The creature roared in fury, its body writhing as it recoiled. But it wasn't done. "You think salt will stop me?" it hissed, its voice filled with disdain. "I am beyond your petty tricks." It lashed out again, this time at Rachel. She raised her mirror, and the reflection caught the creature's form. For a moment it froze, its body flickering as though struggling to maintain its shape. "Now," Sarah yelled. We began chanting, our voices overlapping as we recited the words we had memorized. The fire in the center of the clearing flared, its flames turning an unnatural blue. The creature howled, a sound so loud and piercing it felt like it would split my skull. It thrashed and writhed, its body flickering between solid and shadow as the ritual took hold. "This isn't over," it snarled, its voice echoing in my mind. "You cannot kill what you cannot comprehend." "We'll see about that," Sarah said, her voice filled with determination. The creature's form began to break apart, pieces of it dissolving into black smoke. But even as it disintegrated, its glowing yellow eyes remained, fixed on us with a look of pure hatred. "You are mine," it whispered, its voice fading as its body dissolved completely. The fire died down, leaving the clearing in silence. For a moment, none of us moved. The oppressive energy that had filled the air was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. "Did we do it?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. "I think so," Sarah replied, though she didn't sound convinced. I stared at the spot where the creature had stood, my stomach churning. Something about its final words lingered, a nagging doubt that we hadn't truly seen the last of it. As we packed up our supplies and prepared to leave the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest felt different, yes, but not in the way we'd hoped. It wasn't peaceful, it was waiting. As we crossed the threshold out of the woods, I turned back one last time. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, two glowing yellow eyes stared back at me. The air was suffocating, thick with an unnatural pressure that weighed down on my chest. The clearing seemed to pulse with energy, the shadows shifting and writhing as though alive. This wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a battle for control. The creature wasn't just attacking us physically. It was in our minds, dredging up the memories and fears we had buried deep, using them as weapons against us. It started with Jason. I saw his face in the shadows, twisted in pain and anger. His voice echoed in my mind, accusing me of leaving him behind, of failing him when he needed me most. "Why didn't you save me?" he said, his voice filled with bitterness. "You were supposed to protect me." I stumbled back, clutching my head as the images flooded my mind. Jason's face, his laughter, the way he used to joke about everything, it was all there, warped and distorted by guilt. "You're not real," I whispered, my voice trembling. "This isn't real." But the vision didn't fade. It grew stronger, Jason's voice rising to a deafening roar. Sarah screamed, dropping to her knees as she clutched her head. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror as she stared at something only she could see. "They're gone," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "They're all gone because of me." I didn't know what she was seeing, but I could feel the weight of it. Whatever the creature was showing her, it was tearing her apart. Rachel wasn't immune either. She stood frozen, her eyes darting back and forth as if she were watching something play out in front of her. "It's my fault," she whispered. "I should have stopped it. I should have done more." The creature was feeding on us, using our pain and regrets to tighten its grip. But we had prepared for this. I forced myself to move, to block out the visions and focus on what we needed to do. My hands shook as I lit the talismans, the flames flickering weakly at first before growing brighter. "Sarah," I shouted, throwing her a talisman. "Light it." She looked at me, her eyes glassy with fear, but the sound of my voice seemed to pull her back. With trembling hands, she struck a match and lit the talisman, the flames casting a warm, golden glow around her. Rachel followed suit, lighting her own talisman as the creature shrieked in anger. The effect was immediate. The shadows recoiled from the light, the creature's form flickering and distorting as it stepped back. Its glowing yellow eyes narrowed, and its voice, once confident and mocking, now carried a note of frustration. "You think this will save you?" It snarled, its voice echoing in our minds. "You cannot escape your own minds. I am your fears, I am your regrets." But the talismans held it at bay, their light creating a barrier the creature couldn't cross. We began chanting the incantations we'd spent weeks memorizing. The words felt heavy, their power resonating in the air as we spoke them in unison. The creature roared, its body twisting and writhing as though the sound of the words was tearing it apart. It lunged at us, its claws slicing through the air, but it couldn't break through the barrier of light. For the first time, it looked vulnerable. "You can't hold me forever," it hissed, its voice filled with venom. "I will break you." But we didn't stop. We chanted louder, our voices rising above its screams, forcing it to retreat further into the shadows. As the ritual progressed, the creature's tactics grew more desperate. It shifted forms, taking on the faces of our loved ones, our friends. Jason's face appeared again, his expression twisted with anger and pain. "Stop," he said, his voice breaking. "You're killing me." I hesitated, the talisman faltering in my hand. But then I remembered the truth. This wasn't Jason. It was the creature manipulating me, trying to make me falter. "You're not real," I said firmly, holding the talisman higher. "You're nothing but a lie." The creature shrieked, its form flickering as the light from the talismans grew brighter. Rachel, too, faced her own torment. The creature took the form of her mother, her face filled with disappointment. "You failed," the creature said, its voice cold and cutting. "You'll fail again." But Rachel didn't waver. She gripped her talisman tightly and shouted the incantation, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Sarah was the last to confront her vision. The creature showed her a child, small and fragile, reaching out to her. "Help me," the child whispered. Sarah hesitated, her hands trembling as she stared at the figure. "It's not real," I shouted, my voice cutting through the tension. "Sarah, it's not real." She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and lit her talisman. The flames roared to life, and the child's form dissolved into black smoke. The creature roared, its body unraveling as the incantation reached its peak. The shadows around the clearing began to retreat, drawn toward the creature as though being sucked into a vortex. "You cannot kill me," it snarled, its voice growing weaker. "I am eternal. I am. The final word of the chant silenced it. The creature's body disintegrated, its form collapsing into a pool of black mist that evaporated into the air. The oppressive weight in the clearing lifted, replaced by an eerie stillness. We stood there, breathing heavily, the talisman still glowing faintly in our hands. "Is it gone?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her eyes scanning the clearing. "But we heard it. I know we heard it." I stared at the spot where the creature had stood, my mind racing. It felt like a victory, but the creature's final words echoed in the mind, a haunting reminder that it might not be over. We left the clearing in silence, the weight of what we had faced still heavy on our shoulders. As we crossed the threshold of the forest, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. The shadows were still, but for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw two glowing yellow eyes staring back at me. The air in the clearing was electric, charged with an otherworldly energy that made every breath feel like fire. The ritual was nearing its climax, the words we'd been chanting growing louder, more forceful, as they reverberated through the trees. But it wasn't enough. The creature still stood before us, its form flickering and shifting between shadow and flesh, resisting the pull of the ritual. We knew what we had to do, what the ritual demanded. A sacrifice, something deeply personal, was the only way to sever its hold on us. The first to act was me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the bracelet Jason had given me before the trip. It was a simple thing, a thin leather band with a small metal charm, but it had meant everything to me. Jason had been my best friend, the person who always had my back, and I had failed him. As I held the bracelet over the fire, my hand trembled. Letting it go felt like losing Jason all over again, like admitting I couldn't save him. But I knew what was at stake. With a deep breath, I released it, watching as the flames consumed it. The fire roared, the light growing brighter, and the creature let out a piercing scream. Next was Sarah. She knelt by the fire, her face pale but determined. In her hands she held a photograph, a black and white image of her family from when she was a child. "It's the only one I have," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I've kept it with me my entire life." The pain in her voice was palpable, but she didn't hesitate. She placed the photo in the fire, her eyes glistening with tears as it curled and burned. The flames grew taller, brighter, and the creature recoiled, its body flickering like a dying flame. Rachel was the last. She clutched a pendant in her hands, her knuckles white from the strain. It was an old, weathered thing, the chain frayed and the charm scratched, but it was clear it held immense value to her. "It was my grandmother's," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She gave it to me before she passed. She said it would protect me." Rachel hesitated, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the pendant. The creature seized on her hesitation, its voice cutting through the tension. "You don't have to do this," it said, its tone soft and pleading. "You'll regret it forever." For a moment, I thought Rachel might falter, but then she closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and dropped the pendant into the fire. The flames roared to life, their light pushing back the shadows as the creature let out another ear-piercing scream. Its form twisted and contorted, its once menacing presence now reduced to a writhing, desperate figure. "We're almost there," I yelled, clutching the last talisman. The creature shrieked, its voice filled with pain and rage, but then, suddenly it changed. Its form stabilized, and its voice softened, becoming almost human. "Please," it said, its tone pleading. "Don't do this, I'll leave you alone. You'll never have to see me again." Its glowing yellow eyes dimmed, replaced by something resembling sorrow. Its body, once grotesque and menacing, seemed smaller, weaker. "You've already won," it continued, its voice trembling. "I'm nothing now. Just let me go." For a moment, I hesitated. What if it was telling the truth? What if we had already broken its power, and finishing the ritual was unnecessary? The idea of sparing it felt merciful. "Don't listen to it," Sarah shouted, her voice cutting through my thoughts. "It's lying. You know it's lying." But the creature's voice was so convincing, so full of anguish. "Please," it said again, its tone almost breaking. "You don't have to do this. I'll disappear. I swear." I glanced at Sarah and Rachel, their faces filled with fear and determination. They believed it was a trick, but the doubt in my heart was growing. "What if it's telling the truth?" I said, my voice shaking. "What if we don't have to finish this?" "If you stop now, it'll never end," Sarah said, her voice firm. "You know that. It's just trying to survive." Rachel nodded, her expression fierce. "It's manipulating you. That's what it does. Don't let it win." The creature's eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, everything else faded away. Its voice filled my mind, drowning out Sarah and Rachel. "I can give you peace," it said. "I can make the pain go away. The guilt, the fear, you don't have to carry it anymore. Just let me go." The words were like a dagger, cutting deep into my soul. But then I remembered Jason. I remembered the screams, the scratches on the window, the voice calling my name in the night. I remembered the fear and despair this thing had caused, not just to me but to all of us. And I remembered what we had come here to do. With a surge of determination, I gripped the talisman tightly and stepped forward. "No more lies," I said, my voice steady. "This ends now." The creature's eyes widened, and for the first time I saw fear in them. "You'll regret this," it hissed, its voice losing its pleading tone. "You'll regret it forever." But I didn't falter. I threw the talisman into the fire, completing the ritual. The flames roared, their light engulfing the creature as it screamed in agony. Its form twisted and writhed, the shadows around it collapsing inward like a black hole. The ground beneath us trembled, and the oppressive weight in the air grew unbearable. Then, with a deafening roar, the creature was consumed by the fire, its body dissolving into ash. The light from the flames surged one final time before fading, leaving the clearing in darkness. We stood there in silence, the weight of what we'd done sinking in. The oppressive energy was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. "Is it over?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. "I think so," Sarah said, though her tone was uncertain. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As we left the clearing, the shadows seemed to follow us, lingering at the edges of the trees. And as we crossed the threshold out of the forest, I thought I heard it faint and distant, but unmistakable. Laughter. The creature's voice hung in the air, soft yet insidious, weaving doubt into every word. Its glowing eyes flickered as it looked at each of us, pleading and manipulating with the skill of a predator cornered but still dangerous. "Please," it whispered, its tone almost breaking. "I've suffered enough. Haven't you done enough? Just let me go." For a moment, its words seemed to take root. My grip on the talisman loosened, and my mind raced with questions. Could it really be over? Could sparing it bring us peace? That's when Rachel stepped forward. "It's lying," she said, her voice steady despite the fear etched into her face. Her eyes burned with determination, cutting through the creature's web of deceit. "It's always been lying." The creature snarled, its eyes narrowing as it turned its attention to Rachel. "You think you're brave?" it hissed, its tone shifting to something colder, more venomous. "You're nothing. You're broken, weak, and afraid. I know what you fear, Rachel. I know every dark corner of your mind." Rachel's hands trembled, but she didn't flinch. She clutched her talisman tighter and stepped closer to the fire, her voice rising above the creature's. "You don't scare me," she said. "Not anymore." The final chant began. Rachel's voice was firm, unwavering as she recited the incantation we had practiced. The words carried a power that seemed to ripple through the clearing, shaking the very air around us. The creature's form flickered violently, its shadowy edges fraying like a piece of cloth being torn apart. "No," it roared, its voice echoing like thunder. You don't understand what you're doing." But Rachel didn't stop. The talisman in her hand began to glow, the light growing brighter with each word she spoke. The creature writhed and screamed, its body distorting as though it were being ripped from reality itself. I joined in, the words spilling from my lips as the energy in the clearing reached a fever pitch. Sarah followed, her voice blending with ours, creating a harmony that felt ancient and powerful. The fire roared higher, its flames turning a blinding white as the talismans in our hands burned with an intensity that made it hard to hold onto them. The creature's form began to collapse, its once imposing presence reduced to a crumpled, writhing mass. Its screams echoed through the woods, a cacophony of rage, fear, and desperation. "You'll regret this," it bellowed, its voice cracking as its body disintegrated. "You'll never be free of me." With a final, deafening shriek, the creature dissolved into ash. The black mist that had surrounded it evaporated, carried away by a sudden gust of wind that swept through the clearing. And then silence. We stood there, trembling, our hands still clutching the now dim talismans. The fire burned low, its once roaring flames reduced to a faint glow that barely illuminated the clearing. For the first time in weeks, the forest was still. The oppressive weight that had hung over us since the beginning was gone, replaced by an eerie, almost peaceful quiet. The shadows no longer felt alive, no longer seemed to watch us from the edges of the clearing. "I think it's over," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Rachel nodded, though she didn't look convinced. "We finished the chant. We destroyed it. It's gone." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The three of us stood in silence, waiting for anything to happen. But the forest remained still, the air calm and quiet. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. "We did it," Rachel said, her voice filled with relief. "We actually did it." Sarah let out a shaky laugh, wiping tears from her eyes. "It's over," she said. "We're free." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to feel the same sense of relief that they did. But deep down, a lingering doubt gnawed at me. The creature had been so confident, so sure of itself. What if this was just another trick? As we gathered our supplies and prepared to leave the clearing, the air around us remained calm. The oppressive energy that had once filled the forest was gone, replaced by an almost eerie stillness. But as we stepped out of the clearing and began our journey back to the edge of the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We crossed the threshold of the forest just as the first rays of dawn began to break through the trees. The sight of the road ahead filled me with a sense of relief I hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. But as I turned back one last time, something caught my eye. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, two glowing yellow eyes stared back at me. The drive back home was silent. None of us spoke, too drained to even try. The oppressive energy of the woods had lifted, but the weight of what we had done and what we had seen still clung to us like a shadow. By the time I reached my front door, the exhaustion hit me like a wave. My body ached, my mind was clouded, and all I wanted was to collapse into bed and forget, even if only for a little while. For a brief moment, as I stepped into the familiar comfort of my home, I allowed myself to believe it was over. The first week passed uneventfully. Sarah and I kept in touch, texting and calling each other daily, checking in to make sure we were both okay. Rachel, on the other hand, had gone quiet. She didn't respond to texts or answer her phone. but we assumed she just needed time to process everything. Life began to feel normal. I went back to work. Sarah started making plans to move to a new city. And for the first time in months, I began to hope that the nightmare was truly behind us. But then, the nightmares started. At first, they were vague, fragmented. I'd find myself back in the woods, wandering through the dense trees, the shadows closing in around me. I could hear the creature's voice, soft and insidious, calling my name, taunting me. "You think it's over," it whispered, the sound echoing in my mind. "You think you're safe." I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, but I told myself they were just dreams. My mind was still processing everything we'd been through, and it would take time to heal. But then, the dreams started to change. I began waking up to strange things. The first time, it was scratches on my bedroom walls, long, jagged marks that hadn't been there the night before. I convinced myself it was nothing, that I must have overlooked them. But then it happened again, and again. The scratches appeared in different places: my bedroom door, the hallway, even the ceiling above my bed. Each time they grew deeper, more deliberate, as though something was trying to claw its way in. The shadows came next. At first they were subtle, just flickers in the corner of my vision, gone the moment I turned my head. But over time they became more pronounced. I'd see them moving across the walls, darting behind furniture, lurking just out of reach. They didn't feel like ordinary shadows. They felt alive. One night, I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I saw it, a dark figure standing in the hallway, its outline barely visible in the dim light. I froze, my heart pounding as I stared at it, waiting for it to move. But it didn't. It just stood there, watching me. When I finally mustered the courage to turn on the lights, it was gone. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the signs kept piling up. Doors that I knew I had closed would be open in the morning. Lights flickered without explanation. And the nightmares, they grew more vivid, more real. In one dream, I found myself back in the clearing. The pit we had filled was open again, and the creature was standing there, its glowing yellow eyes fixed on me. "You can't run," it said, its voice a guttural growl. "You'll never escape me." I woke up screaming, my throat raw and my sheets soaked with sweat. Sarah was the first person I called. "I think it's back," I said, my voice shaking. She didn't hesitate. "You're not the only one." She told me about the scratches she'd found on her walls, the strange noises outside her window, the shadows she'd seen moving through her apartment. "It's happening again," she said. "We didn't destroy it, we just weakened it." Rachel finally answered her phone a few days later. Her voice was shaky, barely recognizable. "I thought I was losing my mind," she said. "The nightmares, the shadows, I didn't want to believe it. But it's real, isn't it? It's still here." We all agreed to meet at my house that night. Whatever was happening, we needed to face it together. The atmosphere in my house that evening was tense. We sat in the living room, our voices hushed as we shared our experiences. "It's not just tormenting us," Sarah said. "It's rebuilding itself. It's feeding on our fear again, just like before." "But we did the ritual," Rachel said, her voice filled with desperation. "We did everything right." "We missed something," I said. "We underestimated it, again." As the night wore on, the shadows in the house seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. The air grew cold, and the familiar sense of being watched returned. At one point, the lights flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness. When they came back on, we all saw the scratches on the walls, deeper and more deliberate than ever. "This isn't just a haunting," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "It's a warning." "What do we do?" Rachel asked, her eyes wide with fear. "We go back," I said, the words heavy in my mouth. "To the woods, to the clearing. We finish this, once and for all." The thought of returning to that place was unbearable, but we knew we didn't have a choice. The creature wasn't just tormenting us, it was growing stronger. If we didn't act now, it would eventually break free, and no one would be safe. We spent the rest of the night preparing, gathering the tools and supplies we would need for one final confrontation. As we stood at the edge of the forest the next morning, the weight of what we were about to do settled over us like a shroud. "This is it," Sarah said, gripping her talisman tightly. "No turning back," I said, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at me. And with that, we stepped into the woods. It was late at night when Sarah called, her voice trembling with fear. I had just managed to convince myself that the strange occurrences, the scratches, the shadows, the nightmares were tricks of my exhausted mind. But the moment I heard Sarah's voice, I knew those lies wouldn't hold. "It's not dead," she whispered, her words barely audible over the static on the line. "It's weaker, but it's still here. We missed something." The room seemed to tilt around me as her words sank in. My grip on the phone tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me already knew. There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her voice cracked with barely contained terror. "The creature wasn't just bound to us. It's in us." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Everything we'd experienced, the nightmares, the shadows, the scratches, it wasn't just the creature tormenting us from the outside. It was inside us, woven into our thoughts, feeding on our fear and despair. "That's why the ritual didn't work," Sarah continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "We tried to destroy it, but it was already too late. When we first encountered it, when it mimicked us, it wasn't just playing with us. It was binding itself to us." I felt the blood drain from my face as memories of the woods flooded back. The creature had always been in our minds, pulling our deepest fears to the surface, manipulating us with the voices of our loved ones. It had never been a physical battle. The entire time it had been planting seeds, rooting itself in our psyches like a parasite. "It's why we keep seeing it," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "Why we can't escape it. It's not just out there, it's in here." Rachel joined the call moments later, her voice shaking as she described what had been happening to her. "It's worse now," she said. "I keep hearing it, not outside, but in my head. It's whispering things, telling me I can't win, that I should just give up." "That's how it gets stronger," Sarah said. "By making us doubt ourselves, by making us afraid. Every time we give in, it grows." "But how do we stop it?" Rachel asked, panic creeping into her voice. "How do you fight something that's part of you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. I thought back to the ritual, to the sacrifices we'd made and the words we'd chanted. It had felt so final, so absolute. But we had underestimated the creature's cunning. It hadn't just survived, it had evolved. "We have to go back," I said finally, the weight of my words pressing down on me like a vice. "To the clearing. To where it all started. If it's still tied to us, there has to be a way to sever that connection." Sarah hesitated. "And if we can't?" "Then we don't leave the woods," I said, my voice flat. The decision was made. We gathered what supplies we had left: salt, talismans, the remnants of the ritual texts, and met at the edge of the forest the following night. The air was colder than I remembered, the darkness deeper. "It feels stronger," Rachel said, shivering despite the heavy jacket she wore. "Because it is," Sarah replied grimly. "It knows we're coming." As we stepped into the woods, the oppressive energy hit us like a wall. Every step felt heavier, the shadows seeming to close in around us. The trees whispered with a language I couldn't understand, their branches creaking as though alive. "It's watching us," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "I know," I replied. "Let it watch. This time we're ready." We reached the clearing just before midnight. It looked different now, darker and more twisted, as though the forest itself had warped around the creature's presence. The pit we had dug was completely open, the ground around it blackened and cracked. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. We formed a circle around the pit, lighting the candles and laying down the salt. The air grew heavier with every passing second, the silence almost deafening. The creature appeared without warning. One moment, the clearing was empty. The next, it was standing before us, its grotesque form larger and more menacing than ever. Its yellow eyes burned like twin suns, and its voice, guttural and distorted, echoed in our minds. "You shouldn't have come back," it said, its tone laced with malice. "We didn't have a choice," I replied, gripping the talisman around my neck. It laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You think you can sever me? I am you. Every fear, every doubt, every regret you gave me life. You can't destroy me without destroying yourselves." Its words hit like a physical blow, but we didn't falter. Sarah began the chant, her voice steady despite the creature's looming presence. Rachel and I joined in, the words flowing from us with a force that seemed to vibrate through the air. The creature shrieked, its form flickering as the power of the chant began to take hold. "You cannot win," it roared, its body writhing as though in agony. "You'll never be free of me." But we didn't stop. The talismans burned brighter, their light cutting through the darkness like a blade. The creature lunged, but it was repelled by the barrier of salt, its claws scraping uselessly against the invisible wall. "You're nothing without us," I said, my voice rising above its screams. "You're just a parasite, and we're taking our lives back." As the chant reached its peak, the creature's body began to collapse, its form unraveling like threads pulled from a frayed fabric. "No," it bellowed, its voice filled with desperation. "You need me. Without me, you're nothing." The final word of the chant silenced it. The creature let out a final, deafening scream as it was pulled into the pit, its body disintegrating into black mist. The ground shook violently, the pit glowing with an otherworldly light before collapsing in on itself. And then, silence. For a moment, none of us moved. The oppressive weight in the clearing was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. "It's over," Sarah said, her voice trembling. But as we turned to leave, a familiar voice echoed in my mind. "You can't kill what's already a part of you." We thought the battle was over. We thought we had severed its connection, cast it back into the shadows where it belonged. But as the days passed and the whispers returned, we realized how deeply we had underestimated it. This time we wouldn't rely on rituals or talismans. We'd been too reactive before, always scrambling to respond to its moves, letting it dictate the terms. That had been our greatest mistake. If we were going to end this, we had to take control. We had to find its true weakness and strike it where it hurt most. The problem was we didn't know what that weakness was. The creature wasn't just a physical being. It was an idea, a manifestation of our fears, our doubts, our regrets. It had woven itself into the fabric of who we were, feeding on the darkest parts of our souls. Destroying it meant more than just banishing it. It meant unraveling the threads it had used to bind itself to us. "We've been looking at this all wrong," Sarah said one night, her voice filled with exhaustion and determination. We were sitting in her apartment, surrounded by books, notes, and half-empty coffee cups. The air was heavy with the weight of our shared burden. "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning forward. "We've been trying to kill it," she said, her eyes dark with frustration. "But you can't kill something like this. It's not alive. Not in the way we understand. It's a parasite. And the only way to get rid of a parasite is to take away its food source." Her words made sense, but they also filled me with dread. The creature's food source was us, our fear, our pain, our guilt. It thrived on the emotions we couldn't control, the parts of ourselves we couldn't escape. "So what do we do?" Rachel asked, her voice quiet. Sarah looked at each of us, her expression grim. "We starve it." Starving it was easier said than done. We couldn't simply stop being afraid. Fear wasn't something you could turn off. It was instinctive, primal, a part of what made us human. But we could learn to face it. The next few weeks were a blur of research and self-reflection. We pored over every text, every scrap of folklore and legend we could find, searching for anything that might give us an edge. At the same time, we turned inward, confronting the fears and regrets the creature had used to manipulate us. For me, it was Jason. The guilt of losing him, of not being able to save him, had been the creature's strongest weapon against me. It had used his voice, his face, to break me. But Jason was gone, and no amount of self-recrimination would bring him back. I spent hours sitting alone, replaying the memories, forcing myself to let go of the guilt. It wasn't easy, it wasn't quick, but with each passing day I felt a little stronger. Sarah and Rachel were doing the same, though we didn't talk about it much. Some battles were too personal to share, even with each other. What mattered was that we were making progress. The shadows in the corners of our vision began to fade. The scratches on the walls stopped appearing. The nightmares became less frequent. It wasn't gone, not completely, but it was weaker. But we knew we couldn't just let it fade into the background. If we didn't finish it, it would find a way to come back. It would latch onto someone else, use their fears to rebuild itself. We couldn't let that happen. Our breakthrough came late one night, as Sarah pored over an ancient text she'd found in a dusty corner of the library. "This is it," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of excitement and fear. Rachel and I leaned over her shoulder, our eyes scanning the page. It described a creature eerily similar to ours, a parasitic entity that fed on fear and despair. But unlike the other legends we'd read, this one offered a solution. To sever the parasite's hold, one must face it not with fear, but with truth. For it is lies that bind it, and truth that will destroy it. The words struck a chord. The creature had always used lies against us, twisting our memories, distorting our perceptions. It thrived on deception, using it to keep us afraid and vulnerable. If truth was its weakness, then that was how we would fight it. We developed a plan, one that was equal parts terrifying and hopeful. We would return to the clearing one last time, not to banish it, but to confront it. We wouldn't bring talismans or chants. This time we would bring only ourselves. The idea was simple in theory, but daunting in execution. We would stand before the creature and strip away its power, piece by piece, by refusing to let its lies control us. The night of the confrontation was cold and still, the forest eerily quiet as we made our way to the clearing. It felt different this time, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen. When we reached the clearing, the creature was already there, its grotesque form illuminated by the pale moonlight. "You came back," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "You never learn, do you?" This time we didn't flinch. "You don't scare us anymore," Sarah said, stepping forward. Her voice was steady, her eyes locked on the creature. The creature snarled, its glowing yellow eyes narrowing. "You're lying," it hissed. "I can feel your fear. I can taste it." But its words didn't have the same weight they once did. "You don't control us," I said, my voice rising. "You never did. You used our fears against us, but they're not yours to hold. They're ours, and we're taking them back." One by one, we spoke our truths. Sarah confronted the guilt she'd carried since childhood. Rachel faced the pain of losing her grandmother, and I let go of the regret that had haunted me since Jason's disappearance. With each word, the creature's form began to waver, its body flickering like a dying flame. "No," it roared, its voice filled with desperation. "You need me. You can't live without me." But we didn't stop. The creature let out a final, ear-piercing scream as its body disintegrated, collapsing into a cloud of black mist that was carried away by the wind. And then, for the first time, the forest was truly silent. We stood there, trembling, as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. "It's over," Sarah said, her voice filled with quiet relief. This time I believed her. We had faced the creature, not with fear or anger, but with truth. And in doing so, we had destroyed its hold on us and ensured it could never hurt anyone else. As we left the clearing, the sun rising behind us, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. For the first time, I knew we were free.